This screencast is aimed for students studying the EDEXCEL IGCSE or EDEXCEL certificate English language examination with focus on the short writing task, that is to say the question worth 10 marks that comes after the anthology question. Now obviously I will cover material here which is relevant to anybody planning a short writing task. It should be remembered by students studying this paper that you get about 20 minutes for this task, maybe 25, but not that much more. And the length of time you get will depend entirely on how well you know the anthology. Thus, if you're answering the paper in order, whether or not you begin with the long writing task, as I suggest to my students that you do, to maximise the chance of high marks, 45 minutes per section. In this section, you have to analyse a passage from the anthology and this piece of writing. Now, the question is always paired with the anthology question. There's meant to be a thematic link between the two. And I would suggest, therefore, that you are entitled, allowed to echo or borrow from the anthology text in your short writing. This would certainly be a way of speeding up the process. Don't quote directly, probably, but remember that the anthology is actually a very good resource for all the writing types that you might be asked to write. Generally, the focus will be inform, explain, describe, and you should remember this in your planning and in your writing. Don't become too high rhetorical, too involved in argument, too involved in persuasion. That's not really what these are asking. And I've chosen here a typical question from the summer 2012 paper, write a description of an event which was important to you. This could be a sporting event, a festival, or a religious event, for example. And the passage question in this paper was a game of polo with a headless goat. So we start to look at it and we start to think of what the detail of the question is going to be, whether we're informing, explaining, describing. And to a degree here, of course, there will be a mixture of all three, as I would expect in these passages. But if we go back, write a description of an event. I will be expecting to see a lot of description in the writing. Because we've studied the anthology and because we're confident as users of non-fiction writing in this way, we're also aware that our paragraph structure generally reflects this idea of inform, explain, describe. The topic sentence, you could argue, is the information, short and direct. Explanation, offering a little bit more information, perhaps explaining why we're there, what is specifically going on, before we write maybe in a whole new paragraph, more of a descriptive discussion of the events taking place. We've also got to think how the passage in question links to the passage. In terms of this one, of course, it's worth noting that headless goat is a sporting event description. It's a variety of things, but that's really what it is. And I would argue that that would lean us towards a sporting event in our writing now. Yes, you could write about something completely different, but the further you stray from the anthology model, in a way, the harder you're making your task, because it will, I imagine, take you slightly longer to think about what you want to write. Now, if you're somebody who has never attended a sporting event in your life, obviously this is tricky. But there are ways round it. So, if we know goat well, we've just written a little analysis of it. We know that goat has a range of onomatopoeia, of comic figurative language, and I say comic style of figurative language. Remember that one of the keys to Headless Goat is the description of the wacky races at the beginning, and that should throw us back into a sort of rather crass 1970s comic strip style of writing. Lots of colour, lots of noise, lots of humour, lots of sound imagery, lots of colour imagery, lots of smell. And of course a first-person narrative, though with plenty of dialogue over the top. And these therefore could find their way into your piece somewhere. Another example of how this might work came from the 2015 paper where Touching the Void was paired with We All Need Help Sometimes, a newspaper article. And again, when approaching that, if students remember what void is summed up by, first-person narrative, dual perspective, the sense that one is very subjective, one very objective, lots of short dramatic sentences in the highly subjective response, a slightly longer, dispassionate, objective summing up of the situation, a sense of evaluation of the situation, in which there is more considered use of language. Again, thinking of this as a stylistic trope of the passage should enable you to place an amount of that into your writing in the short task. Now, you can't write any form of creative writing without planning. You may only have got 25 minutes maximum or so, but 3 or 4 minutes will work. This is a short task, and so it makes sense to plan accordingly. You can't just start writing and finish because the time's run out. So why don't you start thinking clearly? Planning for 3 or 4 paragraphs only. You might change that slightly, particularly if you want to enter a very short paragraph or 2 for effect, but ideally you're not really thinking of writing any more than that. Make sure that the paragraphs reflect the narrative requirement. Often the inform, explain, describe might fall into different paragraphs, so this isn't always the case. All the way through, because you're going to get your marks for range and variety of writing and range and variety of punctuation and richness of vocabulary and so on, think about trappers the whole way through. And if that's an acronym that you haven't come across before, there are slides on my blog relating to trappers, if you just put that into the search box, but also if you're on the YouTube channel of my school, there's at least one video talking about trappers per se. And plan with the links between the paragraphs in mind so that you get a sense of flow through the piece. And what I've tried to do here is, when I gave this question in class, I gave myself 15 to 20 minutes to write my own response. Now, I'm not going to claim, and please don't imagine that this is a guaranteed 10 out of 10 response. I'm not sure it is. But what I've tried to do is really overdo the sort of writing that I would expect students to be putting into a piece that is short. Notice also that I'm describing an event. I'm not describing the half hour before the event. I'm not describing getting up in the morning, getting into the car, or in this case, getting onto the metro, working out how to buy my ticket in Barcelona because I didn't speak Spanish and so on and so forth. I'm only writing about the event. There's absolutely no need to write about anything else than the question asks. And so my thought process, as I was beginning to plan, can be shown as possible. My original idea was a quick 3-paragraph plan, and it does change slightly, but what I wanted to do was use paragraph 1 to create the setting, to nail my description, thinking about sights that you could see, also wondering about emotive language and thinking about what struck me at the event I'm about to describe, which was a football match in Barcelona, the sheer size of the stadium against the relative quiet of the crowd. I was also keen at this point to try and get colour into my writing. In paragraph 2, I was going to go into slightly more detail about the sound, the sound and lack of sound, if you like, and also about the event itself. The idea was to zoom in this case, to a single member of the crowd, to try and give focus to my description. And in paragraph 3, I wanted to sense a little bit of evaluation of the experience, but also to keep making sure that the images were recapped and came back. And I wanted here to create a link, if you like, between beginning and opening, to do with the food and drink that people had. I also wanted very, very clearly to make it sound like the end of my passage, rather than sound as though I'd run out of time. 2 thoughts struck me as I began to write. Literally. One was to make sure that I split paragraph 1 up so I had a very short paragraph, purely for effect. And the other was a realization as I started to write, and it was literally as I started to write, that I could link the sports and religious idea of the question effectively, I hope, in the passage. So here's the writing. Now, I'm not going to sit here and read it out to you because the next slide has got highlighted colour to try and show my thought processes. So what I suggest is that you pause for a moment and just read this description before I move on to the slide where I've tried to show my thought processes. So if you want to pause now. And assuming that you've come back, let's move into looking at what I've tried to do. And I've tried to colour code here a little, using red for maybe emotive language, or certainly language chosen to create effect. I've tried to use green for figurative language, yellow for a specific technique such as a rhetorical question. Purple generally might be short sentences, or again, things chosen in that sort of way. And when we look at it, we're struck, I hope, straight away with enough material and enough variety to tick off those boxes on the mark scheme. I open, after the vastness, with a metaphor describing the stadium as a huge bowl with a luxurious green base, bathed, again, nice use of language, I hope, in a startlingly pure white light. And again, I was quite keen to make a point. Anybody who has attended night sporting events is aware that the light of the floodlights is very much part of enhancing the atmosphere when you walk into the ground. I'm describing the sky here above the dark heavens. It's just a more imaginative word, I think, than sky. There's a sense of vastness in it. There's a sense of something infinite about it, and it sits like a lid. Again, a figurative, in this case a simile, closing us in and increasing the sense of anticipation. At this point, I realise I've written quite a lot of long sentences, and although I've used a bit of punctuation as a dash in the first sentence, it's time for a short sentence. 2 longish sentences, time for a short one. I love night games. Then all around the crowd, and I'm using now parentheses, again, another tick box maybe, but this is where I begin to link the religion to the sport. Our fellow worshippers at the shrine of Barcelona Football Club sit and chat in low tones. A true congregation. Notice that I've tried to use a colon here correctly to suggest that there's more information about to be given. I then repeat the word congregation quite deliberately at the start of this short second paragraph, just to make that link between the 2 paragraphs, but also to enhance the sense of the religious feeling. And against it, I want to clash the lurid hot dogs and the quantities of amber fluid. I could have written beer, I could have written lager, but somehow that lacks description. The third paragraph begins to, again, engage with the event itself. Short sentences. Where was the singing? A rhetorical question suggesting my perspective. Nowhere. Answered with a short, strong response. And because it's a short, strong response, it requires an exclamation mark. Again, I'm getting range into this. This is Europe, North London. And I now, as in this religious idea of linking White Hart Lane to a temple, respectful silence, and then I zoom in. There's the respectful silence, which existed, it was a surprise actually, was broken regularly by an old man sitting to my right. And he was very loud in his yelling at the referee, and so I picked him up like a voice like a demented crow, a simile. And because I've called him a crow, of course, I've then said that he wouldn't shout, but I've said he would caw, the sound that you might use of a crow. If you want to say somebody looked like a cow, then he should moo when he speaks, or whatever it might be. I'm again picking up these ideas of vocabulary to enhance. The supporters are now acolytes, servers at a religious ceremony. I'm using a compound adjective, the ear-splitting whistles. And notice if you are going to use a compound adjective or a compound noun, you must hyphenate them. And I conclude that paragraph with another very short sentence. In the last sentence, again, last paragraph rather, more metaphor, more strong language, I hope, more short sentence, and the final image of wading through the empty hot dog cartons and the plastic cups, hopefully linking us back to the beginning with this image of the lurid drinks that we saw, lurid hot dogs rather, that we saw in the second paragraph. And hopefully concluding with a sentence that sounds like this is actually all I intended to write. Now, whether this would get 10 out of 10, I don't know, to be perfectly honest. I think it's quite good. It has a lot of deliberately overdone, possibly, writing for effect in it. I haven't really made out why this event was important to me, and possibly I could have done more in that regard in the time, but as I say, I gave myself 15 minutes. And if you were writing against the clock at the end of an exam, this piece will get you an awful lot more marks than a slightly waffly, lots of long sentences, not planned thought process. Everything I've put on this page was deliberate. Nothing has been left to chance. As a final slide, it's worth just looking at this rather beautiful piece of writing that it's been going around the internet for a while, and my colleague Jade Boyle at John Lyon passed it to me. I'm not sure where she got it from, but I've seen it a few times on the internet since then. And actually it works best when it is written out loud. This sentence has 5 words. Here are 5 more words. 5-word sentences are fine, but several together become monotonous. Listen to what is happening. The writing is getting boring. The sound of it drones. It's like a stuck record. The ear demands some variety. Now listen. I vary the sentence length and I create music. Music. The writing sings. It has a pleasant rhythm, a lilt, a harmony. I use short sentences. And I use sentences of medium length. And sometimes, when I'm certain the reader is rested, I will engage him with a sentence of considerable length, a sentence that burns with energy and builds with all the impetus of a crescendo, the roll of drums, the crash of the cymbals, sounds that say, listen to this, it is important. So write with a combination of short, medium, and long sentences. Create a sound that pleases the reader's ear. Don't just write words, write music. And whoever Gary Provost was, I cannot thank him enough for this little example of how the written word can come alive when it has variety. You can't read your passage aloud in an exam, but you can be aware of the effect of your variety of sentence lengths, your choice of words, and your choice of punctuation in terms of engaging a reader. That's far more interesting to me than gaining marks, but the simple fact is that for many of you, in a week or so's time, that's what you will be writing for. Very best of luck.